Alright, I've talked quite a bit throughout my videos about how I feel it would be great if Honkai were to add a system to the game where they buff old units. As a thought experiment, today I'd like to talk about why I feel so strongly about that, and also how I think it could be implemented if it were to happen. To start off, if we go back to my very first video, I talked about how my favorite characters in the game were Jingliu and Blade. Those characters have definitely fallen off, though I guess Blade has made a small comeback with Super Break. They're not the only ones though. There's plenty of old characters 4 and 5 star alike that simply don't see much use anymore. It's not just your DPS like Jingliu and Blade, but the supports too. I mean, when was the last time you used your Yukong or even your Silverwolf? To me, someone who started playing Hoyo games after playing both FGO and Arknights, it kind of felt like a bit of a culture shock. In those other games, you can use your units pretty much wherever you want, and both of them have systems in place to keep the older units relevant long term. It was like, what do you mean the character I rolled for, or even spent money on, isn't going to be useful anymore? It didn't really make a whole lot of sense at first, and it sucked to actually play through it. Old characters essentially falling off a cliff in terms of usefulness unless you do super gimmicky team comps doesn't feel super amazing, considering one of the reasons that you roll for characters is because you like playing them as they are normally, not in some weird team comp like a Super Break Blade where it ends up as a support showcase. Obviously, as time went on, I got somewhat used to it, otherwise I wouldn't be here playing the game still, but that kind of thought is always there in the back of my mind. It's become less of a, what do you mean my characters suck, and more of a, well, if they suck, then why don't they buff them then? You could say it's a money thing, like maybe they want to keep working on new characters as they believe that would sell more, or maybe they offer new versions of older characters rather than fixing the ones currently in the game so that people have to keep rolling for new things. I honestly don't know if I fully agree with that take though, because it's not like they couldn't make money from revitalizing old characters. The way that I look at buffs is that it not only gives a reason for players that use those old units to build them back up again, but it also gives those same players a reason to potentially invest more in them. For example, back on Jingliu's release, I contemplated going for her Eidolons. While I didn't end up doing that, if she were buffed, then I feel that it brings that back onto the table as a potential use for my Jades. That's not even including giving people a chance to go for all the different light cones, or more importantly, a chance for players that never got Jingliu in the first place to actually get her once she gets buffed. Quite frankly, changing a few multiplier numbers or adding a line of text to an ability is a hell of a lot cheaper development-wise than creating an entirely new character would be, and that's where I feel the argument of money kinda gets just tossed out the window. It's a cheap way to revitalize old characters without having to design an entirely different old form of them, and it also would feel less frustrating on the player's end because they can still use their old characters. Also, as a quick aside on the topic of money, if they really wanted to be printing it, then they'd probably be offering skins, but they just don't do that either.
What do you think about my new dress? Pretty neat, right?
You could also say it's the nature of a gacha game. If an old character gets buffed, why would you roll for the new character that's been released instead of going back to the old ones? Personally, I think that also falls through as an argument because the very large majority of players don't specifically roll just for gameplay. There's a ton of people that just roll due to their attachment to a character, whether that's through their design, their voice, how they were in the story, or whatever else. An old character getting buffed isn't necessarily going to make those types of players care any more than they did beforehand. Lastly, I see a lot of people saying that it's not the characters that need a buff, but that there should be more supports for different archetypes for characters that are underperforming. Personally though, I just don't think supports are the real solution to the problem because supports have never buffed multipliers directly. What supports do instead is they interact with characters' underlying stats like attack, HP, and damage bonus, which basically means it's impossible to design an HP buffing support for someone like Blade in a way where the next HP scaling unit wouldn't immediately overshadow him whenever that's released. And that's not even taking into account the fact that newer units tend to have higher base multipliers than older units, which widens the gap even further. Would that HP support help Blade? Yes, that's undeniable, but they won't permanently bring him back into relevance because even though it might initially seem like that support is made for him, whenever that future HP scaling unit is released, he'd immediately fall off again. In my opinion, all three of those arguments, be it money, the nature of gachas, or the characters and niches just needing a support, really fall through when you look past the top layer. And this just leads me back to the question of, why don't they buff them? So let's talk about how they could potentially do this. Something I've always loved about FGO is that they have a rank up system in their game to buff their characters. There's two ways that these rank ups go. They either just directly give you a few combat missions that let you immediately get the buff after you do it, simply called a rank up, or they give you a small story chapter with some combat at the end that's focused on the character called an interlude, and then you get the buff after you complete that. Obviously in either case you get the buff, it's just the manner that you get it would be slightly different. I think if Hoyo were to bring something like that into HSR, honestly I think it would fit pretty seamlessly into the pre-existing companion mission system. They could even split it up so that only the 5-star characters get the interludes with story content, while the 4 stars would get the buff through the basic combat stages. These different interludes and combat stages would be a great way to add in flavor text to characters as well. For example, in the Blade trailer you see him fighting multiple copies of Dan Heng, so his story interlude can introduce something like that directly into the game. After clearing the stage, Blade could end up feeling more in control of his Mara affliction, and then as a result, he gains additional combat capabilities. Alongside that, most of the time FGO essentially turns these strengthening quests into an event, meaning that there's a portion of time where that's what they expect the player to be doing. On Hoyo's end, this could result in this kind of event replacing the relatively pointless ones we get, like the Boot Hill assignment one that ran a week ago or so. Something I've always loved about those FGO events is that they only tell you the class of the units that's getting the buff until the day they actually get it. For example, they'll tell you a destruction unit is getting a buff, but they won't tell you it's Clara that's getting it. This can lead to a lot of hype in the community, like thinking about who the buff is for, what the buff is going to be, and things like that. And that kind of thing ends up as a pretty fun experience, at least in my opinion. As far as rewards go, FGO usually gives a small amount of rolling currency for completing the different missions, which would work pretty well in HSR if it were to replace the pointless events. They've also more recently started letting players who don't even own the characters do the mission too so that they can claim their rewards, but they obviously can't make use out of the buff part of the mission as they don't have the character. One last thing to mention with this type of buff system is that at least in FGO's case, there's usually a rerun banner alongside of the buff. This would allow Hoyo to do more frequent reruns to line their pockets, while also giving people who have been waiting for that character a chance to get them sooner. For example, it's been over a year since Sela has had her last rerun. A different way they could do it is by giving characters they want to buff a unique item, kind of like modules from Arknights or exclusive equipment from Epic 7. Unlike FGO's version where the buffs are obtained through quests, these games offer them as an item through some form of mission, crafting, or the ability to just buy it through a shop using in-game currency, kind of like the priceless jewels shop in HSR. A mission or task system like defeating a certain amount of monsters would give players a reason to specifically use the characters they want to get the buff for. A crafting system would incentivize players to actually go around the map and collect materials from the different mobs, or potentially even use their resin if it required any materials like an elite monster drop. This would definitely be a more simplistic way of adding a buff system to the game, but at the end of the day, something is way better than nothing. The other idea I had was to implement a buffing system similar to Dragalia Lost mana circles. In that game, every unit had a skill tree kind of like Traces in HSR. Any unit that the devs felt was underpowered or that was lower rarity would get branch expansion so their tree would grow, thus giving them an opportunity to get more stats and abilities. If this was brought into HSR, we could even get more major traces for characters that desperately need them. With how impactful major traces can be, this could be more than enough to bring those characters back into relevance without having to do anything that changes the base kit of the unit. Take Mose for example. If he doesn't have his 3 major traces actives, it feels like you're sacking a slot in your team rather than having someone that's actually useful. This makes him feel pretty miserable when you start using him, but then he starts to feel like a real character later once all those traces are active. That strength could then be further increased if they were to expand his trace tree. Really, it doesn't matter how it gets added, just that it does. It's honestly sad to think that no matter what, after you get a character you really like, in the current state of HSR there's no real longevity with them unless they're a support. Though, even supports aren't immune to that if we consider what's coming next patch. At the end of the day, simple implementations are still solutions to the problem, and at this point that's all we really need. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, it just needs to be added. I think what honestly frustrates me more about the buffing discussion is that a lot of people say, well, that's just how it is, we're playing a gacha after all. But that's just simply not true. FGO, Arknights, E7, and Dragalia Lost are just a few examples of games that have done buffs, but there's plenty of others too. Even Hoyo's own game, Honkai 3rd, has an augmenting system for their different units. To me, it feels like we've reached a point where characters are being released that are direct upgrades to other characters, and I feel that now that we've reached that point, there needs to be systems put in place to counteract that. In my opinion, characters of the same rarity power creeping each other does not lend itself to a good player experience. But that's just my opinion. I'm sure there's people out there that are more interested in always getting something new, and honestly, that's a valid take on the topic. I just personally find it disappointing that my old favorites will all end up getting replaced eventually, regardless of whatever their role is in the game. How do you feel about this? Would you like to see a buff system added to the game, and how would you implement it? Feel free to let me know down in the comments below. Anyway, that's my rant. As always, thank you very much for watching. Join my Discord link down below, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.